These lectures are not designed for use as medical references to diagnose, treat, or prevent medical or mental health illnesses or trauma. If you have questions about the diagnosis, treatment, or prevention of a medical condition or mental illness, you should consult your personal physician or other mental health professional.
In her book, The Unwinding of the Miracle, a memoir of life, death, and everything that comes after, Julie Yip Williams poignantly describes her fight with colon cancer that ended with her death when she was only 42 years old, leaving behind her husband and 2 young daughters. In this book, she tells us that life has a 100% mortality rate. Each of us will die, and most of us have no idea when. She commands us to live while you're living, friends. It was somewhat of a miracle that she made it to age 42. She was born poor and blind in China, where her parents saw her as a burden and asked that she be euthanized as an infant. She wasn't, and the family eventually escaped to the US, where she had surgery and was able to regain some sight. She eventually graduated from Harvard, married her husband, and had her daughters. In her book, we learn of her diagnosis and how she cycled through Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's famous stages of grieving: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. She says, "Health is wasted on the healthy, and life is wasted on the living." But what she missed the most was the mundane, the simple ritual of loading and unloading the dishwasher, making Costco runs, watching TV with Josh, her husband, or taking our kids to school. She reminds us that we control how much effort we put into living and pleads with us not to waste one single drop. In today's lecture, we'll tackle a difficult but important topic: death and dying. And although all of us will experience it, we rarely talk about it. We'll use our CBT toolbox to better understand and better cope with what I call the beginning of the end of life. What I mean by this is simply when we've been given a terminal diagnosis, or perhaps our chronic diseases have progressed to the point of becoming life-threatening. Death is not imminent, but it's certain. It might be a year, 2 years, or even 3 years away, but we most likely know the cause of our death. Let me first acknowledge that this direct, unapologetic look at death and dying is very much culturally bound. In some cultures, terminal diagnoses are not shared for fear of stressing out the individual and hastening death. I know of no data that support this idea, but do want to be respectful and mindful of other traditions and beliefs. On the other hand, I also don't have data that preparing for death gives you any more time, although what it might not give you in quantity, it can give you in quality. It's not about helping you live longer, it's about helping you make the most of the time you have, and ultimately helping you to have what has been called a good death. Although we won't take a detailed look at the traditional stages of death and dying, we will be looking at the tasks of dying, the psychological, physical, ethical, legal, and spiritual challenges that may arise. Remember that our CBT tools target emotion regulation and social, occupational, and physical functioning, often with a big dose of behavior change along the way. We'll use those same tools, but in a slightly different configuration. End-of-life care is defined as medical care for patients with an advanced, progressive, and incurable illness. It includes the transition from curative care to palliative care, and it almost always includes a multidisciplinary team that includes mental health providers. Most commonly, it's focused on medical symptoms, the alleviation of pain, the alleviation of shortness of breath, but it's intended to include mental health, depression, anxiety, stress, as well as quality of life, and as well as supporting family and friends. According to the Institute of Medicine, palliative care seeks to prevent, relieve, reduce, or soothe the symptoms of disease or disorder without affecting a cure. Palliative care in this broad sense, then, is not restricted to those who are dying or those enrolled in hospice programs. It attends closely to the emotional, spiritual, and practical needs and goals of patients and those close to them. Although we will focus on end of life, I think these interventions can be helpful to anyone, whether you're healthy or ill. Now let's go back to one of our cases, the case of David, the 73-year-old man who's had a recurrence of colon cancer. He was first diagnosed when he was 67 years old and went through several intense cycles of chemotherapy followed by surgery. The results were great, and he thought that now he was cancer-free. But about 2 years ago, his GI symptoms returned, and his worst fears came true. The cancer was back, and this time it was inoperable. It could be slowed, and his symptoms could be managed, but he was told the colon cancer would most likely be fatal in the next few years. This next clip was a good way into our first session, and I had the sense that David wasn't someone who shows a lot of emotions. It was just our first visit, but he seemed like a stoic guy that might need some help accessing his emotions and allowing himself to be vulnerable. But first, we needed a frame. Let's take a look. Well, welcome, and I'm glad you're here. And I think what you're doing is very difficult, but really important and really commendable. I can only imagine the kind of difficulties your family's had over the past 6 years and the sort of roller coaster ride that it sounds like you've had, and particularly the past year and a half where there was a recurrence and then it looked better and then it looked worse. And it sounds like you've had some conversations with your family and have come to the conclusion that aggressive treatment is not an option or not one that you would want, and that it's more about maximizing quality of life, functionality, time, managing symptoms, and like you said, the art of dying, to try to figure out what the heck that means.
Yeah, it's tough because it's a little bit lonely. I know my kids have tried to press me into, come on, Dad, there's always hope if you just keep going with this therapy and all that kind of thing. But I think I've just resigned myself to the fact that, and I have to convince them of that,
Right.
And that to me, it's more important to live out what life I have left without having to go through all of that stuff, because that just, I don't want to spend my time there.
Right. There's quantity of life and there's quality of life.
Right.
And they don't necessarily mean the same thing. So I agree.
I'm looking for the quality.
The quality is what's important, and we all have a limited quantity, but in your case, it looks like there is a recurrence, and you most likely know what your cause of death will be, even though we don't know exactly when that might happen. Okay. Well, like I said, I'm glad you're here. We do a lot of work with people who are at the beginning of the end of life, and by that I mean people who have a chronic disease that is progressive and most likely, at some point in the future, maybe a couple years, down the road, it might be the cause of their death. There are different goals that we can set to help you with that. Mm-hmm. They typically include identification and management of stress, management of mood. So it stirs up a lot of feelings. It's a pretty heavy thing to talk about for you and your family. So grief, depression, anxiety, guilt, regrets, sort of
all those things.
That all fits, and things that we can work on. Ways to improve your symptoms. There are a lot of tricks and tips that we've learned along the way to help with things like nausea or pain or insomnia or whatever symptoms that you might be experiencing. How to work with your medical team. A lot of doctors, a lot of medical providers, and they're not always on the same page. But you and feeling empowered enough to step up and say, hey, this is what I want. Right. And letting them know that you want to be a part of that decision-making process. And then I guess the last related part is quality of life, and that means different things for different people. So if there are some activities or people or relationships, that you want to make sure you hold on to, we'll do everything we can to help you with that. If there are relationships that need fixing or things on your list that you want to make sure you do, then we'll also work on that.
Sure.
So we'll spend today doing sort of a survey of the landscape of what's going on for you, what some of the more urgent or pressing problems are, what some of your goals are, how we define quality, and then we'll think about a way for us to work together. There's no one right formula, so we're going to tailor this as much as we can. And the more you're willing to share, the more you're willing to to open your heart and be vulnerable, I think the further we'll be able to get. But we'll do this at your pace, and I'm going to follow your lead with that.
Okay, great.
How does that sound?
That sounds excellent. That's really why I'm here.
Okay, well, let's get started here.
Okay.
So here we have a structured approach to working with end of life. The structure is helpful in that it binds the anxiety that might emerge from a freer form therapy. It has clear assessments and clear goals rather than peering into the abyss. Each of these modules and accompanying worksheets can be found in our therapist guide and patient workbook called Minding the Body, put out by Oxford University Press. It's a 4-module, 12-session program that grew out of the UCSF Comprehensive Care Team funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I think you'll see many of our core CBT tools making an appearance. Module 1, which has 3 sessions, focuses on stress and coping. First, we look at the phenomenon of medical illness and its relationship to stress. Second, we start breaking out some of those CBT tools. We talk about the relationship between stressors, how we think about stressors, and the primary and secondary appraisals that we might make. Third, we look at coping skills, both emotion-focused coping as well as problem-focused coping. What are David's current habits, and how might we help him develop better habits, more effective habits of coping? Module 2 also has 3 sessions, and here we focus on mood management or emotion regulation. We look at 3 primary emotions. We look at depression or sadness. We look at the management of anxiety and fear, and we look at the management of anger and irritability. You know a lot of emotion regulation strategies already in your CBT toolbox, and that's exactly what we use in this module. Module 3 has only 2 sessions, but we focus here on social supports. We want to help him to define and maybe expand his social support network. Who's important? Who does he want to pull closer? We want to help him develop his skills around communication, but not just with significant others or family or friends, also with his medical team. And we want to help him develop skills of negotiation and dealing with conflict. The 4th module talks about quality of life and includes 3 sessions. First, we talk about managing medical symptoms. What are some of the tricks that we got from a hospice nurse to help with shortness of breath, to help with back pain, to help with nausea, to help with the lack of appetite? What are some of the goals that he might want to set for the remainder of life that he has? And what can he do looking forward? How do we promote resilience or even transcendence? And the final session, the 12th session, is really a rehash, a recap, and a practicing of those skills. Since quality of life is a new construct that we really haven't talked about specifically in this course, let's take a moment to define it. Now, quality of life is a multidimensional construct that includes physical symptoms and functional abilities, so that includes what sorts of activities or behaviors you're able to engage in. It includes psychological functioning, so here we're talking about mental health, and that can include your ability to process cognitive information, memory, recall, but it also includes things like depression and anxiety. It will include social adjustment. What's the current status of your social relationships? And it also includes spirituality, defined broadly. The most common proxy measure for quality of life is a questionnaire called the Karnofsky Performance Status Scale, or just the KPS. Or remember that you can go to the Promise at www.healthmeasures.net and find one called Promise 29 that measures the quality of life in multiple different domains. You can also just create your own definition for quality of life and use a visual analog scale from 1 to 100, where higher scores equal higher quality of life. I will say that defining and measuring this important construct can be really interesting even if you aren't ill. What are the things that raise your quality of life? What are the things that sustain it? What are the things that maybe take it away? But let's circle back to the toolbox we've been using and see what tools matter. And I should say that I do a lot of work in this area, but not just because I work in internal medicine. I work in this area because I think our ending is just as important as our beginning. Unless we die suddenly and unexpectedly, we have a critically important opportunity to make things right, to grow, to love, to help those who love us. I often feel honored to be part of that intimate process of family experiences when someone dies. From a purely CBT perspective, It's also a time when nearly all the CBT tools can be in play. It's about emotions, it's about behavior, it's about interpersonal conflicts, managing medical symptoms, and more. So let's look at that toolbox. We, of course, are going to do an initial assessment. Depression and anxiety are common, as are measuring the intensity of the more worrisome medical symptoms like chronic pain, fatigue, or nausea. We'll also want to measure quality of life, first with that simple visual analog scale of 1 to 100, along with fleshing out what it means subjectively. Then we want to find or create some self-monitoring tools, another foundational CBT skill, usually done in conjunction with setting some SMART goals, remembering to keep them concrete and realistic. Hopefully this is all sounding quite familiar. From the behavioral section of our toolbox, we'll want to do some activity monitoring and some scheduling, but with an eye to finding realistic activities given any physical limitations or physical symptoms. We also want to make sure that there's a good showing of social activities, since social withdrawal is common with end-of-life challenges. Communication training and assertiveness will be key, both with family and medical providers. Somatic quieting exercises like meditation or progressive muscle relaxation can also be quite helpful. From the cognitive side, we will absolutely use thought records, but also savoring, directed attention, and our problem-solving therapy skills. The more advanced and nuanced skills will include acceptance of the situation and of the self, forgiveness of others and of the self, and expressions of gratitude. It will be key to remember that there's no one right way to go about this, and there are many ways to have a good death. And here we return to the idea of self-acceptance and self-compassion. But isn't this depressing? Will it make patients give up hope? Will it discourage families? Let's see how this came up for David. And what I'd like to say, even though, we're talking about sort of death and dying and end of life, I don't want you to give up hope either. I always tell patients it's important to hope for the best but prepare for the worst. So, we can hope that a new treatment comes along. We can hope that something changes, or maybe they're wrong about 2 years. Maybe it's longer than that. We don't know. Yeah. And it's good to hope. It's good to keep that optimism and a positive mood. But you're right. There are certain realities that say you should, get things in order and do everything that you can to help your family and help yourself.
I think the hope is extremely important, and I know I have to hang on to that. And I've always been a pretty lighthearted guy my whole life, and so I don't want to get too serious about this, but I can tell you that, like you were talking about the pain earlier, and when that arises, that's almost like a snap back to reality. And, it's there, and I can't ignore that. So that's telling me, that keeps reminding me of the alarm clock getting closer to the, Yeah. And so, and that's definitely my issue. But, but then I have to get outside of myself and say, how is this for everyone else in my family, and they're trying to keep, they all deal with it differently too, even though we're part of the same family. I have one of my children just, he tries to pretend like it doesn't exist. Where another one is always like, how you feeling today, Dad? You okay?
Nice.
What's going on?
And
so there's this sort of,
yeah.
Dichotomy between how they feel about it and, how I am inside, how much I want to, let them know, I've had a lot of pain this morning, or I don't want to go down that road. But it's hard sometimes, it really is. And that's what I'm trying to deal with in my mind is how do I make it smoother,
Sure. You can tell that pain management is going to be a big part of maximizing his quality of life. But you can also see that he really wants to protect his family, to somehow make this easy for them. He doesn't want to be a burden or overshare with them. We want to help David hold on to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Prognoses can be wrong, but even if not, at least he's made the most of the time he has left. You can also tell that, like most people, he's worried about those who love him. We'll talk more about how end of life affects families, but for now, let's do a quick reframe. The silver lining of a chronic illness is that it gives families the time they need to say goodbye. Nothing has to go unsaid. No opportunity has to be missed. And in terms of being a burden, I think we could ask Miriam about that. Recall that she cared for her mother before her mother died. Miriam, as do many patients, cherishes those last few months when she was able to lavish her love on her mother. In a way, it wasn't Miriam giving a gift to her mother. It was her mother giving a gift to Miriam. Allowing yourself to be loved is a gift we can give to others. Just let that sink in a little. It's the silver lining of a chronic terminal illness. There's a relatively short list of the things that patients want at the end of life. Usually number 1 is freedom from pain. Number 2 is to be at peace with God or whatever they define as their higher power. 3, having family around. 4, they'd like to have their mental faculties, to be mentally aware. They want to make sure that their treatment choices are followed. We'd all like to have our finances in order and feel that our life was meaningful. We'd like to resolve interpersonal conflicts, and most of us would prefer to die at home. Now, of course, CBT can't ensure that all of these will happen, but it can at least offer tools that might help. I asked David what a good death would mean for him, what he wanted as he approached the end. Here's what he said.
So David, let's switch gears a little bit and start a working document that lists specific goals that you'd like to accomplish as a consequence of coming here. Now, I know sort of the big picture goals is to cope with the diagnosis that you've received, to support your family, to try to get things in order. But why don't we talk a little bit more about that, get as concrete and specific as we can, so that we can develop a treatment plan that targets those specific goals. So when you think of goals, or the reason you're here, right, what you'd like to get out of it, what would you like to have happen?
Well, unless you've got a spare colon laying around someplace, I mean, that would probably be number 1 on my list, but I doubt you have that. So a good death, I think, which, encompasses a lot of things, but I think that would probably be, my number 1 goal. How to reach that is...
So a good death. And let me say, I love your sense of humor. I'm glad you're able to use that to add a little bit of levity. Anytime you feel the need, please do, but you also don't have to do that. I don't want you to feel like you have to take care of me or take care of my emotions. So be you, and I'll be me.
That is for me, actually, because that is who I am, or have been, for a long portion of my life. It's harder to do that these days, but
sure.
Sure.
So you said your goal was to have a good death. Can you tell me what a good death would look like?
Well, I guess it would be, as free of pain as possible, certainly, and because that, just, the alone is, that's when I go inside myself and I don't want to be there. I don't want to be in that place.
Right.
So, and having, support from family and friends and emotional well-being as much as possible.
Sure.
As
right.
Approach that hour.
And I know in general we want to maximize quantity and quality. Eventually, like you said, everyone dies at some point, and we sometimes have an image of what we would like that death to be like, sometimes not. You have the opportunity to think about, what a good death would be like. You'd like to have your symptoms well managed, and particularly have your pain well controlled. You mentioned people, so I'm wondering if you would prefer to have people around you, to be surrounded by friends and loved ones, or would you prefer to be
I think
alone?
so, yeah. I think definitely, I can't, I've seen movies or something, where people want to go off and die by themselves, and that is not me.
Okay.
It definitely not.
Okay. And do you picture yourself at home or in the hospital?
Yes,
or?
At home.
Okay. So at home, surrounded by loved ones with good symptom management, maximizing sort of emotional wellness
Yes.
as much as possible, up to the point of death.
Yes.
Okay. What other specific goals do you have between now and whenever that time might happen?
You know, I hadn't really thought about specific goals. I suppose maybe it's time I did. I'm not sure what those would be exactly. You know, other than there are times when I think about like all the things I didn't do that I probably had wanted to do, but maybe some of those even from the time I was very young and never was going to realize those things anyway. So, you know, specifically, I really don't know because it's almost, wow, I really, I'm not sure I can answer that question.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and you made reference to something that we sometimes call bucket list items. You know, people have a bucket list of things that they would like to do before they die, and it's perfectly fair and valid to think about your list and if there's anything on there that you would like to do. Some of them may not seem doable anymore, or maybe not even that interesting anymore, but something worth reflecting on maybe as part of your homework. Just to give you a little bit of guidance, oftentimes goals will fall into one of four categories. Sometimes it's specifics around stress management. Sometimes it's specifics around management of mood, so like anxiety, depression. Sometimes it's around management of social relationships. So at times there's family conflict that's been going on for decades, you know, and now's your chance to finally sit your sister down or whomever.
Well, you know,
and have
that
those
is
conversations.
one thing, and I touched on that earlier, that,
Yeah.
you know, I didn't have a super close relationship with my brother or sister, so that may be something, but I'm not sure how I would go about that.
Okay.
You know?
Okay. Well, let's not worry too much about the process just yet. So we're thinking about the desired outcome. And sounds like potentially, and you can sleep on this, think about it some more, is revisiting the quality of the relationship that you have with your siblings and deciding whether or not you want that to change. In the last of those four categories, sometimes goals fall in the category of symptom management or medical management or working with your team. Sometimes the team is solid and it's right on the same page as you are, and other times it helps to learn some assertiveness skills or to train your providers in shared decision-making because your opinion might be different, or to bring in new people entirely. So stress, mood, social relationships, and medical symptoms. So what I'll do is I will give you a worksheet that you can take home with you, and you can even sit down with your wife. You know, she may have some ideas for goals too, and I know that she's very much in the forefront of your mind. I'll have you fill them out, and you can come back next time. We'll go over those goals. We'll try to get as specific as we can and figure out which of those that we should start to tackle first.
Okay.
Sounds
good.
Great.
Yep.
What David is doing here is really important for our treatment planning. Now, we have our modules and our tools, but what he's sharing helps us tailor our interventions. Here are some important questions to consider. In defining a good death, what worries you the most? As you think about your death, how do you envision it happening? Who would you like to have around you? What's left to do before you die? Given your biology and your biography, what challenges do you think might get in the way? What resources can you bring forward? What resources might be lacking? Relationships or breaches in relationships come up quite often. I've lost count of how many times a family member in the ICU has held on until a long-lost brother or sister shows up to be forgiven. Ira Byock, an end-of-life physician, wrote a lovely book on this process called Dying Well, and a more recent book called The 4 Things That Matter the Most. He lists the 4 tasks of dying as, please forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, and I love you. First, shake off the defensiveness and modern-day cynicism, and let's look at the simplicity and power of these tasks. Please forgive me. Who hasn't made mistakes? Who doesn't have regrets? As we approach the end of our life, these regrets circle back. They're open wounds that need to close. Ask for forgiveness. Who was at fault probably doesn't matter so much anymore. I forgive you. Holding grudges wastes energy. It's like swallowing poison and thinking it will hurt the person you're mad at. People make mistakes, sometimes terrible mistakes, but begin the process of forgiveness. Thank you. Thank you brings us back to gratitude. In CBT terms, it helps us savor the positive. It helps us remember counter-evidence to our negative core beliefs. And I love you is a direct, honest, and vulnerable expression of our feelings towards another person. It's poignant and irreplaceable and will not soon be forgotten even after you're gone. From a CBT perspective, negative emotions can hold you back from these 4 tasks. Negative automatic thoughts can stop your progress. So use those CBT skills to regulate emotions and find more balanced thoughts so you can move forward with those 4 tasks. Okay, so let's circle back to David in our 4 modules. He's pretty good at keeping things stitched up. So we probably want to give him permission to open up as much or as little as he's comfortable doing. We can anticipate that he might feel more stress, more depression, and maybe more anxiety, at least initially. We want to make sure he has his basic CBT tools in place for emotion regulation and constructive problem solving. We can also anticipate some of the common challenges that come up at end of life and think about how to help him cope. These include things such as challenges to his self-esteem, challenges to identity, changes in functionality, changes in power or relationship, financial stressors, the need for emotion regulation, the challenge between control versus accepting things you can't control, and the possible recurrence of mental illness. Many of the challenges that we talked about in our chronic illness lecture. David eventually brought in his wife to his sessions because he found it too difficult to talk to her on his own. He also reached out to his siblings and worked some things out with his son. And on his own, he came up with what he called his legacy project, something you'll hear more about in lecture 24. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross tells us, death can show us the way to live. It's only when we truly understand that we have a limited time on earth and that we have no way of knowing when our time is up that we will begin to live each day to its fullest, as if it was the only one we had. In our next lecture, we'll do a full review of our CBT toolbox. We'll hear more from Amanda, and we'll explore what new technology tools we can add to the toolbox. Thank you.